ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi, Sarah here, bringing you some of my favourite guests from over the years. This time, it's the story of Ken Faulkner. Ken Faulkner grew up around horses. They were working animals, useful for mustering and helping with the farm work. But Ken's understanding of horses evolved after he got his own horse as a teenager, and he took this deepening understanding with him to the stations of Western Queensland where he worked as a young man. In turn, the horses that Ken worked with helped transform his own understanding of himself. Turned out he had talents and gifts that had been overlooked as a child when he struggled in school. Over the years, Ken developed his own unique style of riding and training horses, a technique that's now known as natural horsemanship. He became so respected for the effect he had on horses and their riders that he's travelled the world teaching in the US, the UK, Europe and Japan. Today, people from all over the world travel to Ken to learn at his property in southeast Queensland, where he rides his favourite horses, Smoke and Buzz. Hi, Ken.
Hey, how are you, Sarah?
I'm very well. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Your father's family came out from England to Australia. How did they pay for the trip?
My grandfather was an English boxer, an English champion barefist boxer, and he knew that he wouldn't have any success owning his own farm in England, so he decided that he was going to move. And he actually took the gold out of his trophies, and that paid for his boat fare for him, his wife and his children at the time. I'm not sure how many, but so he actually traded his gold in, and that paid for the boat fare. And the boat took weeks to get to Perth, and then another boat to Sydney, and then a mail train to a place called Mungandai. Now, I'm not sure if you know where Mungandai is.
I've got to confess I don't.
It's on the Queensland-New South Wales border, and it's fairly marginal country. I think you run a rabbit to the acre or something like that. So I just think about the culture shock from green England to Mungandai.
So as your dad grew older, was he able to take on his own farm, or did he have to find other kinds of work given the kind of country it was?
He tried. I remember he had a few jobs. At one stage he was a bird trapper, and then he worked on properties, and his main job was on orchards. He stayed on an orchard for a man named Mr. Sweet for maybe 18 years. Then he decided he wanted to have his own farm, so we got a farm not too far away, and unfortunately he got hailed out 6 years in a row. And I always remember he standing in the doorway, leaning against the door, puffing on his pipe, and he'd turn around and he'd say, "Oh well, better luck next time." But I really think that hurt him a little bit, because after that he stopped trying to be his own farmer, and he went to the meatworks, and he stayed there till he retired.
Do you remember, Ken, the first time that you got on the back of a horse?
Not really. I was fairly small, and my uncle was a horse breaker and a drover, and he did a little bit of basic rodeo riding. And so the horses were around, and every time he come past, we'd want to sit on the horse. So they'd lead us around. And then as time went by, some of those horses just weren't quite as friendly as they should have been to put up with kids like us.
Well, when you're a kid, when you're a little human, horses are very, very big animals to be around. Were you scared of them as a kid?
I don't think I was scared. They were daunting, and I didn't know what to do, and I just wanted to pat them. And I think a little bit of ignorance of the small child helps a lot. And as I got older, then I realised that they were a bit different, and I accepted that horses were sometimes hard to handle. And yet years and years later, I look back and I think most of them just weren't trained. They were ridden and they did a job, but they weren't educated.
Well, speaking of education, how were things at school for you?
Not good. School was a terrible time of my life.
Why?
I hated it.
What about it?
The teachers didn't understand me. No, I had trouble with my learning capacity, and I used to think I used to have to really put a lot of effort in to learn, and I got to the point where I was struggling, and I just thought I was dumb, and that actually made me a little bit self-conscious as a younger person, and so I decided I'd just fight the system.
And what did that look like?
I just became a bit of a rebel. You could say I was a bit of a smart aleck, and honestly, it was just like my education started when I finished school.
How old were you when you finished school?
We agreed to finish just before I was 15.
Did we?
Yes. We thought it was a good idea if Ken decided to do something else.
And what did you do?
I actually became an apprentice butcher and slaughterman in a country slaughter yards and a country butcher shop.
And how did that suit you?
I liked it. It suited the style of person I was, and I had a couple of uncles that worked in that sort of field too, and I actually found out that I was actually pretty good at manual labour, and part of that was riding horses, mustering sheep and cattle to bring into the yards to be processed.
It must have been great to go from an environment where you felt you were failing to a world where you could feel successful and capable.
I actually felt like I was worth something. As when I started my job, I knew that I was still learning, but I knew I was capable, and yet at school I just didn't feel capable.
Around this time, Ken, you finally got your first horse. What was her name?
My first horse, she was a horse called Beauty. She came from Tenterfield, and she was about 40 years of this older gentleman's breeding. She had some thoroughbred, some heavy horse, some pony, and she was bred as a workhorse, I think, fairly good quality station horse, but she was a very nice horse. And she actually, when they were starting the Australian Stock Horse Society, the people who were starting it actually tried to buy her off me for a lot of money at the time, and I couldn't sell her because I loved her and all that sort of stuff.
And how did she compare to the horses you were familiar with, say at your uncle's place or other farms?
I think old Mr. Baker, or Baker his name was, the man from Tenterfield that bred her, I think he had a little bit more ability and probably a little bit more affinity with horses. So she was fairly quiet. She was fairly uneducated, but her foundation was very good. So I actually got a lot of confidence and comfort from riding her. I did see her buck one day with my uncle, and it was an interesting thing to watch. She did a good job, but not once in her lifetime did she ever try to buck or do anything wrong with me.
How do you remember handling her back then when you're just 15 or 16 or whatever? What skills were you using at that point?
I think you just use the skills that you watch other people around you using. My uncle was interesting because he always thought horses would take advantage of you, and so you had to dominate them. And so that's where I come from. My first introduction with horses was just they'll try and get you wrong. And years and years later, I found out horses don't want trouble, where sometimes we, as people, can't give them a way to sidestep it, if that makes sense. And as I got to riding that horse, I actually was quite comfortable with her, and she let me do a lot. And I didn't really know what I was doing, but I guess it started the style of riding that I like. And in a lot of cases, doubting and not knowing what you're doing gives you the opportunity to add your own personality, send your own character into what you're doing. Sometimes you've got to hide it from your friends because they think it's a little bit wussy. But I think in your own self, you just try your best with the knowledge you have.
After having your first horse, you got the opportunity to start a horse. What's that mean, that term?
In those days, it was called breaking in.
That says something, doesn't it? Breaking in.
Yes.
It's a clear message of the kind of attitude you
Absolutely.
take.
And the mentality, the attitude, and so how you address them. Like, it was oftentimes try to meet muscle with muscle and use constraints and in your training. Now, I don't have a problem with using tools to train a horse, but I do have a problem if it's a sink or swim type method, and some of the old methods were a little sink or swim. But I think there's a process that can make it easier on you and easier on your horse. I don't think the bumps and bruises that I used to get as a young fella would have been there in a more modern age. But it's really hard to be negative about lack of knowledge when that was the norm. It's years later we can look back and make judgment, I guess, but in those days it was normal.
And starting a horse, what used to be called breaking in a horse, is getting them ready to be able to wear a saddle and be ridden in that kind of way.
In those days you just made them rideable.
And what was that like to do with Sascha? How did she respond?
Well, Sascha was a little different because she was Beauty's foal, and she, I had a little 13-acre paddock leased from the CWA Hall at a little place called Broadwater outside of Stanthorpe. And I actually started a broker in around the hall in the car park.
As the ladies were inside having scones and sewing?
Sometimes, yeah.
You provided the entertainment.
Yeah. It was an interesting thing, teaching her to lead. Like, I didn't have any idea how to teach her to lead, and she was my first foal. And luckily I ran into a man that was a friend of the family. His name was Bill Yates. And I said to him one day when I had this foal, and I said, "What can I do? Can you help me, Bill?" And he said, "Yeah, I can help you." He said, "One thing you got to remember, treat them nice, treat them good, and always remember they're a horse and not a pet." And so he was probably years in front of his time, but it helped me start a little bit of a change in my attitude compared to my uncle.
She only had one eye, is that right?
That's right.
And how did that shape, or what did that do to the way you approached working with her?
When she was born, she must have staked it on a stick, or maybe a crow got it or something like that. So she had one eye her whole life. And so long as she knew I was on the blind side and I touched her a lot more, she was fine. And when I got to break her in at the time, she put a little bit of a turn in her head, and she became a very good mustering horse. And so long as you let her have that little turn in her head, so the dominant eye could see where she was going. And she didn't struggle at all.
You finished your apprenticeships, your 2 apprenticeships in butchering and slaughtering. Where did you go and find work after those finished?
After I finished my apprenticeship, I decided I'd like to look at station work and things like that. So I went out towards Texas and...
Texas, Queensland.
That's right, yes. and worked on properties there. They were primarily sheep properties. And then I spent a little bit of time at a place called Glentown, which is between Goondiwindi and St George, at a place called Tabia. And they were primarily cattle. And I sort of liked that life. And honestly, I really didn't think I'd change from that style of living, because I just thought this was me. And I was a little bit nervous of people, a little bit scared of people. So it was a good way for me to hide.
More nervous of people than horses. Hey?
Absolutely.
And were your horse skills developing that whole time? You would have been spending a lot of time on horses and around horses, I guess.
Yes, I had a couple of horses of my own that I was pretty comfortable with. But when I was asked to ride other horses, I was actually a little nervous of them because coming back to my uncle's horses, when I was 15 and I was chasing a steer, a bullock, I actually didn't know if I was strong enough to hold them and stop them after I was pulling up. Now that's a little bit scary. And in those days, I was thinking I'd like to be a rodeo rider and things like that. And I expected to be nervous on a bucking horse and things like that. But I was almost as nervous on the station horses. And I couldn't figure it out until I understood. A lot of them weren't overly well educated. But they were good horses and they did their job. So it's not like they were rank or anything. It's just, I guess I just didn't know what I was doing.
So feeling those nerves around them, what did that result in the way you were handling them?
Actually, it changed. It changed my technique because I sort of figured out that if I was a little bit more tactful with my hands, I could actually talk a horse out of doing something before it got so bad that it couldn't be retrieved.
What do you mean tactful with your hands?
Well, if you're holding the reins in a lighter style, and if the horse thinks about something negative, if you tweak the rein, it changes its brain. And I could actually almost talk my horses into being all right for me for the day. And as I got along, I found out that it was happening on multiple horses, and I thought everybody did that. And yet it was just my nervousness and sometimes ill-conceived nervousness, but it made me a fairly tactful, thoughtful rider to the point where my horses actually did pretty good, and they did good enough that other people around the stations would want to get me to ride one of the young horses. In other words, I was silly enough to hop on. So.
And would you tell those other fellows what you were doing or what your approach was?
I didn't think it was...
It was just what you did?
It was just what you did. And because I was doing it from a almost self-preservation angle, I actually was a little embarrassed to tell people. So it wasn't for years and years that it turned into this thing called natural horsemanship. This little technique that I had that was starting to get my horses to go. My horses tended to be a little softer, and softer in the mouth and softer to my direction.
What do you mean softer for someone who's not a horse person?
Softer. If you give direction through the reins or you squeeze with your leg, my horses seem to go easier with less effort from me as the director. And I felt like sometimes it almost became an imperceptible thing, almost like a thought, and my horses just seemed to get it done. And again, I just thought this is pretty neat and I like it. And I guess I didn't question it more than I liked how my horses started to go.
So, Ken, you said when you first started working on stations, you thought this would be the life that you'd stay with. It obviously suited you in lots of ways. Yeah. But you're also noticing, and other people are noticing, that you've got this talent with horses. Yeah. How did that develop next? Where did you start working specifically directly on a stud with horses?
When I left Stanthorpe, I moved to Redland Bay, and I started work on a horse stud there, and it was a quarter horse stud. So I was involved with breeding, and there were 2 stallions there at the time, and breeding some mares and developing the foals. Part of my job was showing the horses too, in halter and ridden, and having to do something from a more refined technical perspective. I had a lot of learning to do.
A lot of learning.
So I learned while I was on the job. and I did quite well. My horses, again, that little technique helped me a lot. And my horses did quite well. I think we won the Queensland Futurities 4 years in a row, and the Maturities every year after that were for 3 years out of the 4. So we were doing quite well with the style of horses we had. And in those days, it was expected to do multiple events. So you did English and Western events at a show, and I actually started to figure out something, the show ring style. And
Did you like that? Did you like showing horses performing in that kind of way?
I did. There were some things like brushing them that I couldn't. You only brush horses to put a saddle on, but now I've got to clean them. But no, it was good. It was great. It was a style and a part of my life that I did like.
So why did you swap horses for chickens for a time, Ken?
The people at the stud became my in-laws, and we decided that it was time to do something other than the horses as well. So for a little while I managed a meat chicken farm while I was doing the stud work and the horses. And I also started a few horses for myself. At that stage it started to go from breaking in to starting, changing in words. And I managed the meat chicken farm for a little while, and then we bought an egg farm. And while I was there, I actually had my horse business as well.
They don't have the same nobility as an animal, the chicken and the horse?
No, it was different.
Things changed when a rider from WA turned up.
Yes,
at your
that's right.
place. What's that story?
A lady called Margot Duncan. She owned a property in West Australia, and she moved back to Queensland, and she bought a couple of her favourite horses with her. And she asked me one day if I'd help her and train her daughter and ride the horses a little bit. And she decided she liked what I was doing. And one day she said, "Why don't you go and see this international trainer?" Who was a man called Pat Pirelli, came to Australia. And I said, "I just haven't got time and working 7 days a week, young family, all this sort of stuff." And she said, "Of course you can." So I went to a couple of courses and sat as an auditor mainly. And I liked it. And it actually leaned towards what I was already evolving into. The difference was I started to see the animal psychology behind it. And that opened a whole door. But it wasn't to open the door just then. It was a couple of years after that. And then one day Margot came in and said, "Why don't you go to a course?" One of his longer courses.
Over in the States?
Well, it was Australia, and when we looked, all the Australian courses were finished, and they were just about to get ready to go back to America. She said, "We'll go to America." And I said, "Well, don't be silly. I've never even seen an aeroplane, let alone on one." And they said, "No, I can't afford it. It's just way out of my capabilities." About 2 days later, she turned up to watch a horse, and as she walked inside, and she threw a cheque for $2,000 on the table. And she said, "There, now you can go to America." And so I went to America.
Wow, what a beautiful act of generosity.
It was an
from her.
amazing thing. She actually made it possible for me to learn a lot more about what makes horses tick and to become the horseman that I actually was liking. It took 2 years to pay that lady back, and not once did she ask or comment. And I'll always be thankful to her for that, because she probably was instrumental in turning me into the person I liked and I wanted to become.
So with that loan, you went off to California to train with this famous name in natural horsemanship, Pat Pirelli. You say you'd never even been on a plane, Ken. How did you like that?
Oh, I pulled the seatbelt on so tight I bled. But I was looked for a doggy bag. And 27 hours later, I was in America. And I got to Los Angeles, and I had a saddle, a swag, and a suitcase, and I looked like a pack horse trying to get these things down the aisles at the airport. And this captain, this airline captain, actually saw me and felt sorry, and he carried my bag for me and showed me where I needed to go. And from there, I got on a small plane. I think it was about a 12-seater or something.
Put that seatbelt even tighter on one of those.
Well, the wings shook. The first one, I don't think started very well because it rattled.
Well, thankfully, you made it to the trading in one piece, and that's where you spent this month with Pat Pirelli, who's a kind of legendary figure in natural horsemanship. How did that set you on your way to become a professional horseman?
When I first came back from the States, I decided to embrace this whole style of the so-called natural horsemanship. I don't call it natural horsemanship anymore, it's just good horsemanship. But it was termed natural horsemanship at the time. And then I became a clinician for Pat, and I was with him for 11 years. Then I went off by myself, and we started Australian horsemanship. And it took me around the world. At first it was Australia, and I was doing very well and had a good following. And then I had a chance to go to Europe, and while I was there, I started to learn a little bit more about classical dressage and things like that. So I did quite a lot of presentations in Europe, and one memorable presentation was in France. I put my horses in Napoleon's stables, and I rode in Napoleon's riding hall at a place called Fontainebleau. It was the Château, and it was the French cavalry barracks. And I didn't even know it was called that. I was just somewhere. Napoleon wasn't there, so he didn't mind. So.
It's a long way from Stanthorpe.
Oh, gee.
Ken.
When I first went, I didn't even know that horses would understand me because they were French.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. This is Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app. Or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
So, Ken, your formal introduction to the ideas of natural horsemanship began in the States, where you went over for a month-long training. Tell me about some of the people that you met there.
A good friend that was a big influence is a fellow called Dr. Robert Miller, and he travelled the world talking about animal behaviour and things like that. So for the next 30 years, I tried to learn and read everything that he wrote and put down. And his mules were the first mules I ever rode. And I honestly was a bit concerned because I'd heard all these stories about mules. And I said to him one day, what have I got to be careful of? And he said, mules have to be trained how horses should be trained. And that didn't mean anything to me. That didn't help me at all. But I actually thought about it years later, and it did make sense. And his mules were beautiful, and the mule that I rode actually taught me a lot about feel. And then 30 years later, I had an opportunity to go to the World Finals for cowboy dressage. And they asked me to do a couple of presentations and a couple of demonstrations at the World Finals, as well as ride. And my co-presenter was Dr. Robert Miller. So it was a full circle, and I'm always thankful for what he offered me through his books and through his knowledge.
What are some of the lessons that you got from him and his approach to the psychology of horses that was maybe new for you or gave you a new understanding of why what you were doing was working with horses?
Basically, the difference between the predator and the prey animal made a big difference to me. I never even thought about it like that.
I haven't thought about it. So horses are prey?
Horses are prey. They've got a flight line.
What's a flight line?
The flight line is a distance that a prey animal runs after it's been stimulated by a predator. Usually it's about as far as they can run on one breath. And so breeds of horses are a little different, like an Arab or a thoroughbred, a hotterbred horse has a longer flight line than, let's say, a quarter horse. So the flight line's unique to the breed, but all prey animals have a flight line. People are predators. Our eyes are set in the centre of our head. We don't have peripheral focus. A horse has a big peripheral focus. Horses don't have depth perception. They can't see that a shadow's just a shadow. it might be a hole. They can't see that a puddle's only an inch deep, so their depth perception isn't very good. But they can see sudden movement and flick of a tail and the flick of a wing and things like that. So on windy days, horses get a little bit more restless because everything's moving. They can see that, but their focus isn't the same 20/20 focus as we've got. So as we turn our head, our eyes focus straight away. A horse needs time for his eyes to focus, so he runs away. It's called shying, and a shy is just a run away without the away. And so they get a little bit of distance so they can look and see. Now, in those days, I sort of thought, dumb horse. But then later on, Dr. Miller got me to thinking the horse is only looking for self-preservation. My primary aim is, am I safe? Is this going to hurt me? So if he thinks it's going to hurt him, his first instinct is to run from it. When the run's taken off him, then he'll fight. And his fight becomes leverage because he doesn't have horns, meat-eating teeth, cleft feet. So he's not really that useful as a fighting animal. He uses his shoulder. So he comes underneath his opponent or over the top. And you can watch horses leaning against people when they're leading them. A horse, a prey animal, controls another prey animal by controlling direction and speed. So as a trainer, he got me thinking, all I've got to do is control direction and speed. And then years later, I sort of learned that there's two ways of controlling direction and speed. You can inhibit it or you can promote it. Now, some trainers usually lean towards one of those two. But if you can say the same thing in a lot of different ways, your horses will stay a lot more interested.
So with that principle of the flight line, that's what a horse as a prey animal is instinctively going to do.
Yeah.
What does that mean for the way a human most skillfully approaches a horse?
The fresher a horse is, the more they lean towards the prey animal. So if they feel like they're being shut down, they'll resist. And then we feel like they're resisting, so we fight them. And so I think one way of saying it is the better trained a horse is, the further away from the prey animal he gets. So he doesn't have to go back to his base skills and his DNA base. You don't lose it. It's always there.
Can you tell, Ken, when you first meet a horse, just by looking at it, do you get a sense of its character and what it might need? How long does that take to get a handle or an understanding of a particular animal?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's just by looking at it. You can see its type, its tension or its attitude by looking at it. But when you interact, within a very short time, you'll see what the horse has actually been taught to do by other people. And so you address it. Each horse is going to be a bit individual. They're all going to have a flight or fight or a submission. It's an interesting concept, but posture, getting a horse to have a posture of a quiet horse actually builds an attitude of a quiet horse.
What's the posture of a quiet horse look like?
Flatter, relaxed. In the wild, if you saw a horse with his head down, it'd be either sleeping or eating. And so they'd be quiet. If you saw a horse with its head up, it's on guard duty or something's bothered it. So that posture becomes the style of the horse you're riding. When you ride a horse, you're not riding the physical horse, you're riding the emotion. Every time the horse moves his feet, it reflects his emotional state. Horses don't buck you off physically, they buck you off emotionally.
So you've got to work with the feeling of the horse.
Absolutely.
First of all. And have you encountered horses that doesn't work with by nature or by the way what they've experienced with humans?
I think I have to say yes. I've met horses that were a little bit more trouble or needed more help than the person had the ability. I've had horses that I could ride, but I've actually sent home as unstarted because I didn't think they were trustworthy. It took me a few years to come to that. My pride wouldn't let me do that for a long time. But I have no problem at all of saying that horse is not right for you now. But he might be right for you in a few years' time when you've got more knowledge. So horses, I think, have a learning capacity, a bit like people. Some people need to look at it a few times before it sinks in. Some horses look at it once and it sinks in. I think horses have a unique learning propensity that suits them, and probably the comfort of the situation they're in. See, horses just want three things mean a lot to a horse: safety, comfort, fun. Safety's the herd. They live in a herd and they have a hierarchy. Horses actually like to be told because they've learned through centuries of being gregarious to follow the alpha horse. And then comfort. I think the basic comforts to a prey animal is food and water. And if they've got a surplus of food and water, then they have a surplus of energy. So they have to have fun. And if they can't play with another horse, they'll play at another horse. And then we start to take that as being a negative thing. But it's not. It's just a horse trying to get rid of his surplus energy. And surplus energy is probably the biggest detrainer of horses you'll get. A horse with a full gas tank of energy will probably have his own thoughts and probably not fit into the style and the production that you want. So understanding the horse's needs probably is more important than what you do with them.
Do you think that all people can become riders? You know, I've talked about horses
Yes.
learning to be... Tell me
I
more.
think anybody can learn to ride a horse, but I think to be a horseman is a personal thing that's up to you and your own sensitivities. I think there's a difference between a horse rider and a horseman.
Tell me, what is it?
A horse rider just likes riding horses and doesn't question anything, but a horseman wants to look a little deeper at the horse. So I think a horse rider basically rides the outside of the horse, and a horseman rides the inside of the horse. And it just takes a little bit more thought and probably education. And lots of people think riding a horse starts when you're riding the horse, but it's a long way before that in the husbandry. How you pick up the horse, how do you pick his feet, how do you clean him? Is he spoilt? Now, when you say spoilt, what is spoilt? There's not really a word, one thing that makes a spoiled horse, but if you make a list, he won't stand for the farrier. He doesn't like to stand to be brushed. He fights you for the feed bucket. He wants to push you. He's a bully. Most of that's just allowed by the human, and we call it spoilt. When you make the list, you'll see a pattern.
Do people need certain qualities, personal qualities of character almost, to begin with before they can become a good horseman?
Yeah. Years ago, I was fortunate enough to learn from a fellow called Ray Hunt, and he was one of the forefathers of this natural horsemanship style of training. And his teacher was a man called Tom Dorrance, and I got to meet Tom when I was in California. And Ray used to say, if you want the horse of your dreams, become the person who will allow him to be the horse of your dreams. And he said, if you want the horse that you're looking for, get out of his road so he can be. So Ray got me thinking about, if you want the horse, then it probably wouldn't hurt to go and look in the mirror and you'll see the horse you've got. So your personality's going to be reflected into the horse through your style of training.
You have known many horses over your life, Ken. I want to ask you about one named Visitation, if I'm saying that correctly.
Yes,
What
yes.
sort of state was he in when he came to you?
I actually saw Buzz. That's what I call him, Buzz. But his name's Visitation. He's an imported son of Topsail Wiz. And Topsail Wiz was $13 million sire of money earners. And Buzz's full brother's a horse called Wizard Jack. And the style of reining we see in the world today was largely framed by his style of reining. So Buzz is a fairly credentialed horse. But when I first got him, they said he was savage. He actually spent 3 days on a truck with the muzzle on, and the truck driver said he wasn't allowed to take the muzzle off. So I actually wondered what the heck I'd bought, because we didn't pay as much for him as he was worth. And we did still pay a fair bit of money for him, but not the money that they wanted before. But when they said he was savage, they wanted him off the place. So he turned up at my house and was fairly careful with when I was interacting with him. And he was a bit more scared than anything. I remember if you made sudden movements or swung your arms around, he'd get a fright and he'd shake. And I actually learned what learned helplessness was watching that horse, because if he ever jumped out of the shed, if I was saddling him, he'd only jump 20 or 30 feet and then he'd stand there frozen and shake, waiting for his hiding. But he never had the guts to run away.
So this quality that other people had interpreted as savagery was fear?
It was basically fear. He was scared. If you stood beside him, it probably took me 6 months to stand beside him and swing a rope. And there's things in his life that I know I won't be able to fix, but largely he's a great horse, and he's actually a very, very quiet horse. He's actually a people horse. He'll go out of his way to come up for a pat. Just a lovely, lovely horse. He's won me 3 Australian Open Cowboy Dressage titles, 4 Queensland titles. He was the horse that got me to the World Finals. And he's a very, very handy horse. And he's probably the smartest, most athletic horse I've ever sat on.
There's another horse that's very special to you, one called Smoke. Tell me about him.
My go-to horse.
Your go-to horse?
Yeah. If I needed to do something, if I wanted a horse that I needed to rely on, if I needed to catch a steer or rope something, or just if I needed a horse that was really going to be there for me, Smoke was him.
What happened with you and Smoke in 2010, Ken?
I was finishing a bridleless challenge, and it's a challenge ride, so it's obstacles. And the idea was, if you could beat my time, me being bridleless, but you with a bridle, then you get a free rider spot in the next course.
You must have been pretty confident then.
I was fairly.
I don't imagine you like to give those away.
He was pretty nice horse, but I did something dumb, and as I was finishing the challenge, I grabbed at the rail above the gate, and that would have been fine, but my feet hooked in the stirrup and I pulled my hands off the rail. So I was probably 10 or 12 foot in the air and landed on my shoulders. So I fractured my back and split my head and broke my face with my own knees. I was unconscious for a few days, and they didn't think I was going to make much of a recovery. And at first they wondered if I was going to be a paraplegic, and then they wondered if I was going to be a bit of a vegetable. And I bled into the brain, and so my first third of my brain, the personality part of your brain, had blood in it, so I became somebody that wasn't very nice, and it took a long time to recover.
What do you remember about waking up, coming to in the hospital after such a catastrophic injury?
I was unconscious. Well, my eyes were open, but I just wasn't there for 4 days. And I remember a nurse sitting with me for days and days, every hour, and making me lay still. And then on about the 4th day, I woke up and I actually thought it was the next day. Everything was sweet. And I actually didn't suffer very much while I was in hospital. It was when I left the hospital that the real world hit me and I become a bit of a problem. And your brain doesn't work consciously, but your subconscious will tell you who you really are.
Well, in those early weeks and months, can you remember what it felt like inside your brain? What was going on?
It was an empty box. Yeah, I had no thought. I had no ability to think. It took probably 2 years to have a subconscious thought, to have a daydream. It probably took 2 years at least to have a daydream. It took me a few weeks and months to teach myself to walk again.
And how did you go about doing that?
I used to rock until I got up sat on the side of the bed, and then I'd walk my hands up my legs until I was half standing up, and then I'd pick my leg up and with my hands and move it and move it and move it, and it'd take me 3/4 of an hour to walk across a little 2-room house. And then I got this idea that skipping's good. So I got a rope out of the truck and beat myself on the legs, and I had no feeling, and it took a week or so before my brain said ouch. And it was an interesting time. And one day I used to verbally make a story like the cat on a rug, and I'd describe in detail the cat, the rug. And I don't know why I did this. It was just something in my own brain that was functioning. I'd make a trailer or I'd build a fence, and I'd speak it so as my brain, and it started my brain working. One day I was sitting there and I'm thinking, now who the hell am I? Because the doctor said it was my personality side of my part of my brain, and I'll probably be somebody else. And I thought, who the hell am I? Because I didn't really know who I was. I sort of knew things I did, but
You didn't feel like you.
Well, who are you?
You feel like...
Do you really know who you are? And then when somebody tells you you'll be somebody else, you wonder if you are. So one day I got angry and I said, you know what? It's not my problem, it's yours. If you don't like me, go away. Not quite as nice as that. And I'll deal with what's left. And then I started to do something about putting myself together.
You must have really lent on your wife, Kathy, during that.
Oh, I'd put her through hell. She actually needed to go to a psychologist to figure out how to handle me. I had time of depression, and so she had to be in front of all that. And then I wasn't a very nice person for a long time of it. She put up with a lot, and I'll always be thankful before her, because I don't know that anybody else would have put up with me quite that bad.
Do you think she was waiting for the Ken she knew to come back, or?
Well, I guess she didn't know. She didn't know where I was, and she was just dealing with the me that was there. And then one day something happened. I sort of patted the dog or something, and she saw a glimmer of the old Ken, and then slowly but surely I sort of started to come back and be a little bit more personable and be a bit more realistic. And it took a long time to get my brain to work.
Were you spending time with your horses in the early stage or the first stage of that recovery?
About 6 months in, probably less than that, because I still had a fractured back. I decided I was going to run away. So I went down to the horse yards and got Smoke, and I wanted to ride him to see if I was nervous. And I wasn't really nervous. I didn't really know what to do. My brain wasn't functioning that well.
You didn't know how to ride?
I didn't know how to ride, but I won't say it flooded back, but over a period of time, it did return, and when I did something, he'd do something. But I learned something about myself at that point. There was 2 things I learned. One was empathy. Give yourself and basically it went onto the horse and the horse time. And they're only struggling. They're not in trouble. If you're learning, you're only struggling. You're not in trouble. But lots of people try to protect people from the learning to save them from the struggle. But I think the struggle is their discerning character. So I learned a little bit about being a little bit more empathetic, and I learned a lot about don't you quit. It would have been so easy to stop, to quit and be what the doctor said. I just have a hard time with the idea that I quit on anything.
Do you think smoke was extending a bit of empathy to you too? Was he patient with you?
No, Smoke's just a good horse. Smoke is just a great horse. He pretty much only does as much as he needs to. And I think he did give me the good grace to be able to function when I didn't know what I was doing. So probably he did, but I don't know.
I'm there trying to make him a human, and you're reminding me that he's a horse and he was just doing his horse business.
I'm sure there's something that's deeper than the physical act of training a horse. I think there is the spirit or an emotion or something that comes with the training, the deeper self and the higher capabilities of the horse. I think our first responsibility is practical horsemanship, but I think it goes a bit deeper than that.
Horses don't live as long as humans do, Ken.
No.
How difficult is it to say goodbye to horses?
Yeah, us tough men, we just don't think like that. What a load of rubbish. I think if you've got an animal that you spend time with, you can't help but be emotionally hooked to them. So it gets pretty hard to say goodbye to a dog or a horse. And you wouldn't be much of a person if you didn't feel something.
There'd be a special spot on your property when time comes for those two horses you love so much?
They can stay for the rest of their life. There'll be a spot for them. I'm not sure where, and I'm not sure that there'll be a graveyard, but there'll definitely be a spot where they can have their peace.
Ken, I feel like I've learnt so much about horses and people talking to you. Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Thank you for taking me back and letting me take the time to think about who I was and where I came from. It's always fun, and you tend to forget and you tend to believe who you are now without seeing who you were. So it's been a great journey. It's really a fun life that we have.
That was my conversation with Ken Faulkner. It was produced on the lands of the Gadigal, Yagara and Turrbal peoples. The producer was Maggie Morris. Our executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sarah Konoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Konoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.